Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're heading into pretty dark territory, honestly. The eugenics movement.
Yeah, a really unsettling chapter of history, for sure.
We'll be using Francisco Carlos Sacon's 2024 book, Eugenia Scars Que Persistem, as our guide.
Excellent choice.
We're going to unpack how this movement, this whole idea of improving humanity, how it actually played out.
In the United States, Canada, and Brazil.
Exactly. Those three countries specifically.
What strikes me, going into this is how eugenics actually managed to become mainstream science.
Right.
It's a warning, really. It shows how even science, even with good intentions, can be twisted, to support discrimination.
Absolutely. And Sacon's book really digs into that. It traces this path from innocent scientific curiosity, about heredity and things,
Right.
to something really, really sinister.
The term eugenics itself, it was coined way back in 1883.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah, by Francis Galton. A cousin of Charles Darwin, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Brilliant guy, but kind of obsessed with inheritable traits, and that's where it took a dark turn.
In what way?
He believed that everything, intelligence, talent, everything, was predetermined by your genes. And he imagined this future, right, where humanity could be improved through selective breeding.
So basically, taking Darwin's theory of natural selection, but applying it to humans.
Exactly. And in a way, Darwin never intended at all. Darwin was all about how species adapt naturally.
Right, to their environment.
Yeah. But Galton, he wanted to artificially engineer human evolution.
Designed humans. That's where the ethical problems start, for sure.
It's an ethical problem.
It's disturbing to think about.
Yeah.
Just breeding humans like prize horses or something.
Yeah, it's a disturbing concept. And unfortunately, he wasn't alone in thinking this way.
There were others.
Oh, yeah. Thinkers like Charles Davenport, Carl Pearson, Madison Grant, all big names. They helped make eugenics seem legitimate, within science.
So it wasn't just a fringe idea.
Not at all. They saw it as a progressive solution, a way to get rid of poverty, crime, all through manipulating biology.
But poverty and crime, they come from social issues, right? Not just bad genes.
You'd think that'd be obvious. But yeah, it's shocking how this ideology gained traction.
And it did gain traction, big time. In 1912, they held the first International Eugenics Congress.
In London.
And that really solidified eugenics on a global scale, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't some small gathering. Big names were there.
Yeah.
Major Leonard Darwin, Charles Davenport, even Alexander Graham Bell.
Wow.
All advocating for these policies that, in hindsight, are just horrific.
What were some of the policies they were pushing?
Well, the Congress itself was organized by topic.
Okay.
Things like heredity of some human physical characteristics, methods of selection, strategies of racial improvement, all very clinical sounding, but it's all basically social engineering based on flawed science.
And as we know, these ideas, they didn't stay in the halls of academia. They made their way into law, especially in the United States, right?
Yes. The U.S. is a prime example of how eugenic theory was put into practice, and it resulted in real harm.
What specifically? What kind of harm?
Institutions like the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, they went to disturbing lengths.
I've heard of that place.
Led by Charles Davenport. They collected family histories, trying to prove that all sorts of things were hereditary.
Things like family.
Mental illness, even criminality. It's like they were trying to rank humans based on their supposed biological worth.
Using really shaky science to do it. Did this data actually influence any laws?
Absolutely. It was used to justify some of the darkest chapters in American history. Forced sterilization laws, targeting people deemed unfit to have children.
Wow.
And the 1924 Immigration Act severely limited immigration from certain countries.
Based on
Eugenic arguments.
Whoa.
About protecting the racial purity of America.
So basically, prejudice was written into law.
It's terrifying how quickly it happened.
And the case of Buck v. Bell in 1927, a prime example. The Supreme Court actually upheld a law allowing forced sterilization.
Of people considered feeble-minded.
That's just, how could that happen?
Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., he wrote in his ruling, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
It's just mind-blowing that the highest court could disregard human rights like that. But the U.S. wasn't alone, was it?
Sadly, no. Eugenics took root in Canada, too, and the consequences were devastating, especially for Indigenous populations.
Let's talk about that. Sekin's book really brings the Canadian context to life.
It does, and it reveals a really disturbing mix of eugenics and, existing colonial prejudices.
So, like, the existing racism towards indigenous people.
Yes.
And then eugenics came along and was used to justify it.
Exactly. Eugenics was used as a tool for social engineering. The goal: assimilate indigenous peoples into white society.
Let's assimilate.
The Sexual Sterilization Act of Alberta, it was in effect from 1928 to 1972. A truly heartbreaking example. It led to the forced sterilization of something like 2,800 people.
Oh.
Mostly indigenous individuals and people deemed mentally deficient.
The stories from that time are just awful.
They are. Leilani Muir, for example, wrongfully sterilized at just 14 years old.
14.
She had to fight for decades to get compensation.
That's just unimaginable.
It shows the lasting harm these policies cause.
On individuals and whole communities.
Exactly.
And then there's the residential school system. Operating in Canada for over a century.
Horrible.
While not solely about eugenics, it was definitely influenced by those ideas.
Yeah.
Forcing indigenous children from their families, suppressing their cultures.
It was justified by the belief that indigenous cultures were inferior.
Needed to be wiped out.
Duncan Campbell Scott, a high-ranking official in the Department of Indian Affairs.
What did he do?
He was a big proponent of these assimilation policies. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic."
It's chilling. Truly chilling.
It is.
A dark chapter in history, that's for sure. One we have to understand, though. To understand eugenics and colonialism.
I agree.
And now, let's shift focus to Brazil. Eugenics there took on unique forms, right?
It did, shaped by Brazil's own racial and cultural landscape.
Right. Brazil's history with race is very different from the US or Canada.
Much more fluid concept of race, but, racial inequality definitely still existed.
How did eugenics fit into that context?
A key figure was Renato Kiel. He really pushed eugenics in Brazil.
Renato Kiel. Okay.
He was worried about what he called the degeneration of the Brazilian population.
Degeneration.
Because of racial mixing.
So even with all that mixing, there was still this anxiety about racial purity.
It's important to remember this was a time of big change in Brazil, nation building.
Right.
People wanted to create a modern, successful nation.
Makes sense.
And some, like Kiel, thought eugenics was the way to do that.
Sekin's book actually includes some of Kiel's writing.
It does, yeah.
What did he advocate for? I mean, specifically.
Kiel was a prolific writer, for sure. Very influential. He founded the Sociedade Eugênica de São Paulo.
When was that?
In 1917. And he organized the first Brazilian Eugenics Congress.
Wow.
In 1929.
So he was pretty active.
One of his big things was controlling immigration.
How so?
Encouraging Europeans to immigrate, people considered to have good traits.
So basically, whitening the population.
That was the idea. To improve the nation's genetics, supposedly, this idea was all over Latin America back then.
Like European genes were the best.
Exactly. Mixing with other races was seen as a bad thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Similar to the US and Europe at the time. But did everyone in Brazil just go along with this?
Oh, no. There was pushback, even within the eugenics movement itself.
Really?
Sekin talks about Edgar Roquette Pinto, an anthropologist. He was influenced by eugenics, but he had a different take on it, a more progressive one.
Oh, so?
He rejected this obsession with racial purity. He was more about something called positive eugenics.
Positive eugenics. What's that?
Focusing on improving the lives of all Brazilians, basically.
Instead of controlling who reproduces.
Right. He was all about education, sanitation, social reform, making things better for everyone, not just focusing on genetics.
That sounds much more sensible.
Yeah, a much more nuanced view. He understood that it wasn't all about genes.
So in Brazil, you had these two different strands within the eugenics movement.
That's right.
It wasn't one single unified thing.
Exactly. And Sekin really captures that complexity. It shows how even within a flawed ideology, there were people pushing for a more humane approach.
Just a good reminder that history is never simple.
Yeah. You have to look at the nuances. Even within movements we now see as completely wrong, there were people who disagreed.
Challenging the status quo.
Exactly. And those voices are important to remember.
They remind us that even in dark times, people were fighting for a better way. So we've seen how eugenics played out in different countries. But ultimately, it was based on some fundamental flaws.
Scientifically and ethically.
Let's talk about that. What were the biggest problems with the science behind eugenics?
One of the biggest was how they oversimplified heredity.
Okay.
They treated complex traits like intelligence or criminal behavior as if they were determined by single genes.
Like one gene for this, one gene for that.
Yeah, ignoring all the interplay between genes and environment.
Way too simplistic.
Like trying to reduce human behavior to a simple equation.
Doesn't work that way.
Our lives are way too complicated for that, influenced by all kinds of factors.
Upbringing, social environment, everything.
Exactly. And that flawed understanding of heredity, it led to all sorts of bad practices, like collecting family pedigrees to try and prove that undesirable traits were inheritable.
Creating this, hierarchy of human worth.
Based on genes. It's appalling. And then there's the ethical side of it all.
The ethical side is just a nightmare. It was all about prejudice and discrimination.
Advocating for eliminating or segregating entire groups of people.
Just because of their supposed genetic fitness.
Yeah. Forced sterilization, restrictive immigration laws, residential schools, all these horrific things happened because of that belief.
That some people are just inherently better than others based on their genes.
It's terrifying to think about what can happen when science is used to justify oppression.
Scars makes it clear that eugenics was more than just bad science. It was a social and political movement.
Preying on people's anxieties and prejudices.
To justify awful policies.
And that's an important point. It wasn't just a few scientists gone rogue. It was a lot of people. Politicians, social reformers, even some religious leaders.
Wow.
It reflected these big anxieties about race, class, national identity, all those things.
So how did this movement, which caused so much damage, how did it finally lose its grip?
Well, a few things happened.
Okay.
First, the science itself started to unravel.
How so?
Genetics advanced, and it became clear that those simplistic views of heredity, they were just plain wrong. Complex traits couldn't be reduced to single genes. The whole idea of breeding a superior race was just fantasy.
So science debunked itself, basically.
In a way, yes. And then there were the horrors of World War II.
Right.
The Nazis' genocide, it was partly justified by twisted eugenic theories that really exposed the brutality of this ideology.
Yeah. After the war, eugenics became a dirty word, associated with racism and genocide.
Most scientists and politicians couldn't openly support it anymore. It was just too toxic.
It shows how dangerous it is when science gets used for hateful purposes.
Absolutely.
But even though eugenics was discredited after the war, its legacy is still with us, in some ways.
It makes you wonder, are there echoes of eugenics today? Things we should be worried about.
Right. Are we seeing similar ideas popping up again?
That's a crucial question, and Scars doesn't avoid it. He explores these uncomfortable parallels. We live in a time of incredible advances in genetics and biotechnology.
Things that could be misused.
Prenatal genetic testing, for example. It can give parents valuable information, but it also raises these ethical questions.
Like, what if people start using it to choose which babies to have?
Exactly. Selecting based on certain genetic traits. And then there's gene editing technology.
Like CRISPR.
Yes. It has amazing potential to cure genetic diseases.
Right.
But it also raises the possibility of designer babies, a whole new kind of eugenics.
This time focused on enhancing genes, not eliminating them.
Exactly.
Imagine a world where parents can pick their kids' eye color, height, intelligence. Sounds like science fiction.
It does, but it's something we need to think about, seriously.
What are the implications? Where do we draw the line?
These technologies are forcing us to ask some really fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
About who decides what a good gene is.
Right. And those are questions that the legacy of eugenics forces us to confront.
Scars' book is a powerful reminder that we can't just blindly embrace scientific progress. We have to think about the ethics.
Absolutely. The history of eugenics shows what can happen when prejudice and control get disguised as science.
And Scars doesn't let us forget that.
He really drives that point home.
He does.
And he also reminds us that the fight against eugenics isn't over. It's an ongoing struggle to make sure that science is used ethically, that we don't repeat those horrific mistakes.
Let's dig a little deeper into Scars' work. He really goes into the extent of forced sterilization in the U.S.
Oh, yes. It's a chilling chapter, for sure.
He focuses on the period between 1907 and 1939.
A dark period.
Archival records from the Department of Public Health, they reveal that a staggering 60,000 people were sterilized.
Against their will.
It's hard to comprehend that number. And what's even more disturbing is that many of those sterilizations, They weren't even based on real medical diagnoses.
You're absolutely right. Second points that out. They used these incredibly broad criteria. It was discriminatory, plain and simple.
Like what? What kind of criteria?
Socioeconomic conditions played a big role.
Really?
If you were poor, on public assistance, or even just lived in a rural area,
You were more likely to be targeted.
Exactly. It's like they thought poverty itself was genetic.
Ignoring all the social factors that contribute to poverty.
Exactly. And it gets worse. They also used medical and genetic conditions as justification.
Like what? What kind of conditions?
A whole range of things. Mental illness, intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, schizophrenia, even just things that ran in families.
But were the diagnoses even accurate?
Often they were made hastily or they were based on prejudice. They didn't really care about individual circumstances.
So anyone who was different, physically, mentally, socially, they were at risk.
That's a good way to put it. And they framed it all as progress,
Progress.
as if they were improving society. Second includes some excerpts from scientific publications from that time.
What do they say?
It's shocking, really. They talk about these practices as if they're good science, like legitimate advancements. Articles from the American Journal of Sociology, the Annals of Eugenics. It shows how easily ideology can twist science.
It's a scary thought.
It is. These forced sterilizations are a shameful part of American history.
They really are.
It shows how pseudoscience, driven by prejudice and a desire for control, it can lead to the violation of human rights on a massive scale.
Second doesn't just focus on the numbers, though, right?
No, he digs deeper. He found historical documents that show how these policies were implemented.
Giving us the detail.
The specifics. It's disturbing. You see how they twisted scientific concepts to justify what they were doing.
Can you give us an example?
One document Second found is from the Annals of Eugenics.
Yeah.
Published in 1928, it's called Racial Characteristics and Genetic Deterioration. Charles B. Davenport wrote it.
Davenport, he was a big name in the eugenics movement.
Oh, yeah, one of the leaders. In the article, he uses all this scientific language, statistics, genetic terminology, trying to make it sound objective.
But it's not objective at all, is it?
No, his conclusions are pure prejudice.
What does he say?
He basically argues that scientific measures of reproductive control are necessary to preserve national genetic integrity.
So like a genetic cleansing.
That's what it sounds like. And it wasn't just Davenport. Second also found an article from the American Journal of Sociology,
Yep.
published in 1920. It's called Social Heredity and Race Improvement. The author is Irving Fisher.
Another big name in eugenics.
Fisher talks about selective breeding programs to eliminate undesirable traits. It's straight up scientific racism.
Masquerading as social progress.
Exactly. And the tragic thing is, these weren't just theories. They were putting these ideas into practice all across the country.
And people suffered because of it. Inserticon focuses on several specific cases that really highlight this.
Cases that bring it home, make it real.
The case of Buck v. Bell, which we talked about earlier, the 1927 Supreme Court decision, they upheld a law allowing forced sterilization.
Of people they labeled feeble-minded.
Carrie Buck, the young woman at the center of the case.
Wrongfully labeled, of course. Sterilized against her will. And the Supreme Court said it was okay.
Justice Holmes wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Just a chilling statement.
It is. And that ruling, it stayed in place until 1974.
So for almost 50 years, it was legal to sterilize people against their will.
Tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized.
It's just unbelievable.
Sayakon also talks about Ann Cooper Hewitt, a wealthy socialite.
What happened to her?
Her own mother had her sterilized in 1936.
Her own mother.
Hewitt's mother was a big believer in eugenics. She used her money and influence to have her daughter declared mentally unfit and sterilized without her consent. It shows how eugenics could be used to control people, even within families.
It makes you wonder how many other cases like that there were. Cases that we'll never know about.
It's a disturbing thought, and it's important to remember these forced sterilization programs, they disproportionately targeted women.
Women? Why women?
They were seen as the carriers of genetic defects.
So they were the ones they focused on.
In California, for example, over 20,000 forced sterilizations.
Yeah.
About 60% of the victims were women, and within that group, Latinas and Black women were overrepresented.
It's that same pattern. Targeting the most vulnerable people. Over and over again.
It's a pattern we see throughout history, and eugenics is no exception.
It's really disheartening.
Second also brings us a more recent case, the Ralph sisters.
When was this?
The 1970s.
Wow. So even after the eugenics movement was supposedly over,
2 young black girls from Alabama,
what happened?
sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Their mother signed a form, but she didn't understand what she was signing.
That's awful.
This case, it caused a lot of outrage. People started paying more attention to these federally funded sterilization programs.
So it had some positive impact, at least.
It did. It's a reminder that we have to speak out against injustice.
The Rolfe sisters case shows that the legacy of eugenics, it didn't just disappear overnight. These ideas were still in the system.
Harming vulnerable people.
We have to be vigilant. Watch out for these kinds of practices.
Even if they're not as obvious as they used to be.
Secon's work, it's a powerful reminder of the human cost of eugenics. This wasn't just an intellectual debate. It was real people's lives.
Families, communities, all affected by these policies.
And Secon doesn't just leave us with despair. He talks about resistance. People who fought back against these injustices.
Activists, lawyers, organizations.
People who challenged eugenic policies, who fought for the rights of those who were targeted.
And even within science, there were people who spoke out against eugenics from the start.
They saw what was wrong with it.
The flawed science, the racism, the ethics, they challenged it all.
It's inspiring, to see people standing up for what's right, even when it's hard.
It gives you hope. Hope that we can learn from the past.
And build a better future, where everyone is treated with dignity, no matter their genes.
A future worth fighting for. And Secon's book, it gives us the knowledge, the tools to keep fighting.
As we finish up this deep dive into eugenics, one question keeps coming to mind. What can we do to make sure that science and technology are used ethically?
Especially in areas like genetics and reproduction, it's a crucial question.
What safeguards do we need?
Transparency is key, I think. We need open, honest conversations about the potential benefits and risks of these technologies.
No more hiding behind scientific jargon.
No, people need clear information so they can understand what's at stake.
Makes sense. What else?
Strong ethical guidelines developed by a wide range of people, not just scientists.
Who else?
Ethicists, social scientists, people from the communities that will be directly affected.
It's about making sure science serves humanity.
Exactly. And it's about remembering the past, learning from those mistakes so we don't repeat them.
So we can use the power of science for good.
For a better world. For everyone.
Well said. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope our listeners will keep thinking about these important issues.
It's been a pleasure.
And continue the conversation about how to make sure science is used for good, not for harm. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.